with that, I would like to turn it over to and thank for coming, Jean Wakatsuki.
Thank you so much, Robert. Robert, that's your name. Or Mr. Simpkins. Well, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I must say it's a pleasure to be here. I think the last time I was here could have been maybe 20, 30 years ago. And I had dinner tonight with some of the members of your faculty. I'm sorry I can't remember his name right now, but he said that he met me then, that we met. And
Jay
so,
Hargis?
yes, when was it?
It was not 30 years ago, I know that.
A little while back, yeah.
About 10 or 12.
Yeah, and it was here.
Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, I'm glad to be back.
30.
And it's so nice to see you all here. Now, it really seems impossible that I woke up early this morning in Santa Cruz, California, where I live, on the Monterey Bay, where it was rainy and foggy and cold. And so I wore a jacket. But then when I got to Stockton, it was very hot. I thought, wow, this is California weather, not like Hawaii. Well, but I've learned again that California does have just a myriad of climate, because now it's rainy, it's not cold, but it's foggy, and it's great. Anyway, thank you, Dr. Simpkins, for inviting me to speak tonight. And I also like to thank Lori Parker, Jay Hargis, and Jay Navarrete for inviting me to speak to you tonight. And I thank all of you for being here. Now, I'm first going to do a more formal presentation, and it won't take that long, but then after, I hope there'll be a lot of questions, because that's really when we can get some dynamics going, okay? When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands on December 7th, 1941, I was 7 years old. And this tragic act plunged the United States into World War II. And as for those of you who have read the book already know, I was the youngest of 10 children, and my father was a commercial fisherman in Southern California. We lived in Santa Monica, where my father had 2 fishing boats, which he called the Golden Hind and the Near Reef. Now, my father was an Issei, or of the first generation, which means he was born in Japan and immigrated here to this country. Actually, he came as a student. And he was actually 17 years old when he came in 1904. So that makes him a pioneer to the West Coast. Just as some of your American ancestors may have come to the East Coast of America from Europe or from Africa, or to California from Mexico and Central and South America. Now, my mother was Nisei of the second generation. She was an American citizen because she was born in Hawaii, which was then a territory of the United States. That was in 1897. And as you know, Hawaii became a state in 1959. So with my father, Issei, first generation, and my mother, Nisei, my brothers and sisters and myself were somewhere between Nisei and Sansei, which is the third generation. So half of my family considers themselves Nisei, and the bottom half consider themselves Sansei. And so I think of myself as Sansei. And today there are many 4th and 5th generation Japanese Americans, especially in California. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, a very unfortunate thing happened. In February of 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which ordered the relocation and internment of persons dangerous to the security of the United States. Now, this was supposed to mean anyone dangerous to America's national security. And you know, we were at war with Germany at the time. As a result of this edict, the entire Japanese American population on the West Coast was rounded up and put into 10 main camps in various remote parts of the country. This meant 120,000 individuals of Japanese descent, of whom almost 70% were native-born American citizens, like myself, born here in the United States, were uprooted from their homes and communities and removed to strange lands. Many people first were put into fairgrounds and racetracks, forced to live in horse stalls until the more permanent camps were built. Manzanar was the first permanent camp to open when our family arrived there in April 1942. Now, America was at war with Italy and Germany too, but only Japanese American families were rounded up excuse me, and imprisoned in concentration camps. Now, why was this possible? How could this happen in America? Land of freedom and equality? What were the factors that led to this? First was panic and fear. Although 3,000 miles away in the Pacific, it was the closest thing to invasion the United States mainland had ever experienced. There was hysteria. And unfortunately, the newspapers and radio fed this fear with irresponsible journalism, fanning hatred and irrational response with intense propaganda. Remember, there was no television in those days. There were no investigative reporters interviewing elderly people and women and children filing into these desolate camps. So in many ways, it was a secret act. But the press was as inflammatory as it can be today, as it is today. And I put a lot of the blame of hysteria on their shoulders. The military was the first to propose removing the Japanese from the West Coast. They soon received authorization from President Roosevelt with Executive Order 9066, even though the head of the FBI at the time, J. Edgar Hoover, claimed the Japanese were not a security threat. And in his estimation that they were a very loyal immigrant group. But he was overruled by the Western War Command headed by General John DeWitt. And Executive Order 9066 was put into action, but only against the Japanese, not against the Germans or the Italians. But a very powerful factor allowed this injustice to go forward and cannot be ignored, and that was racism. Since the Chinese immigrants first arrived in the 1840s to work in the mines and for the railroad, there had been intense anti-Asian feelings on the West Coast. This was more than 100 years ago. At that time in California, there was a great labor shortage, and big companies looked to the east for workers. The first Asian arrivals were often seen as threatening, simply because they looked different, were strangers, and spoke a different language. Soon, after building railroads and providing the back-breaking labor for the development of the West Coast, they saved their money and began having businesses and buying land. They became economic competitors. And this economic threat spurred legislation to prevent Asians from owning land. And this is how it was accomplished. First, in 1911, a law was passed which prevented aliens or non-American citizens of Asian background from becoming citizens. Then in 1913, 2 years later, another law was passed denying ownership of land to non-citizens. Thus, my father, who came to America in 1904, who had contributed to its growth as a pioneer, could not become a citizen, nor could he own land until 1952, when the Walter McCarran Immigration and Nationality Act allowed him the right to naturalize. That was the year I graduated from high school. Then in 1956, the year I graduated from college, California voters repealed the alien land law by a 2-to-1 margin. Despite these racially imposed barriers, many families prospered. The Japanese were very successful farmers and fishermen. And by 1941, they controlled 40% of the truck farming business in California. But with the forced internment, most of these families lost their properties and businesses, and they dropped out of American society for an average of 3 years. Actually longer, because after the war was over and the camps closed, most preferred to slip back into their communities unnoticed. Still reeling from the massive displacement, there was fear of further racism. Rumors of lynchings, house burnings, and violence had swept through the camps. Jobs and housing were scarce, and the majority was at economic zero. Everyone had to work very hard just to survive and recover economically. And of course, many families never did recover their losses. Most of the public were unaware of the 100th, thank you. Most of the public were unaware of the 100th Battalion and 442nd Regimental Combat Team. The Nisei fighting unit that fought so valiantly in Europe, earning more Purple Hearts and medals than any other military group of its size. They were young Japanese-American soldiers, some volunteers from Hawaii, and others drafted out of the camp, some who proved the ultimate loyalty by sacrificing their lives. 35,000 American men and women, Japanese American men and women served in the armed forces during World War II. 2,500 in the Pacific Theater as military intelligence soldiers, called MacArthur's secret weapon. Their intelligence work is purported to have shortened the war in the Pacific by at least a year. But still for many, the recovery period after the war was very harsh, with survival from day to day the only goal. Now, World War II took place more than 70 years ago, 1941 to 1945. Farewell to Manzanar was written 30 years later. And since its publication in 1973, I have spoken to many, many groups about the internment experience. And always, two questions are invariably asked. One, why did it take so long to tell my story? Why 30 years after the event? And two, do I think it can ever happen again in America? For many years, Manzanar had remained a dim memory, something the family rarely talked about. I used to think I dreamt those years in camp. And it wasn't until almost 30 years later that I revived those dreams and collaborated with my husband to write about them. And this is how it happened. In 1971, my nephew, who was attending UC Berkeley, came to visit in Santa Cruz, where we did. He was taking a sociology class, And for the first time in his life, outside of talk in the family, he heard the word Manzanar. "Auntie," he said, "you know I was born at Manzanar and I don't know anything about that place. Can you tell me something about it?" Excuse me, his professor had pointed out the existence of camps, but that was all. Until then, Manzanar had seemed more a family myth than an actual fact to my nephew. "Sure," I said, "but why don't you ask your folks, your parents?" "I have," he said, "but they seem reluctant, like I shouldn't be asking, or there's some skeleton in the closet I'm not supposed to know about." That's strange, I thought. Whenever our family talked about camp, which was not often, we joked about things such as the lousy food, the dust storms, the communal showers. We talked lightheartedly about the outdoor movies, the baseball games, and school. So I proceeded to tell the same stories in the same superficial way, as if I was sharing some summer camp experience. My nephew looked at me intently, very quiet, and said, "Auntie, that's bizarre. You were locked up in a prison. I mean, how did you feel about that?" For a moment, I was stunned. He asked a question no one had ever asked before, a question I had never dared to ask myself. How did I feel? And for the first time in my life, I dropped the cover of humor and nonchalance and allowed myself to feel. And I began to cry. I couldn't stop. My poor nephew was upset. What had he done to send his auntie into such hysterics? I realized then why his parents were unable to tell him about Manzanar. At the time, I was auntie to 33 nieces and nephews. 7 had been born in camp, and I was certain none knew about their birthplace. So I decided to write a memoir, a history, just for the family. But I found that whenever I tried to write, I would break down. I simply could not get past the first sentence. So I turned to my husband, a writer and teacher at the University of California at Santa Cruz, and told him of my problem. "What memoir?" he asked. Now, Jim and I had been married 14 years at that time, and I had known him for 5 years before we married, and I had never told him about Manzanar. He knew of some camp in my background, but I had never revealed my true feelings, and when I did, he was stunned. And then he said, "This is not a story just for your family. It's a story everyone in America should know. Let's work on this together." Thus began a collaboration that lasted for a year. I talked for hours into a tape recorder, and we interviewed family and other internees and researched the libraries. The months spent delving into those 3 years of my childhood and its aftermath was as powerfully therapeutic as years as a psychiatrist, and a lot cheaper. I discovered how powerfully embedded in my memory those 3 years were. We found there were already 40 books written on the internment, but they were mostly academic and political. We found no personal stories from internees themselves that addressed the emotional and psychological damage of the experience. Not only was there the cultural attitude, "Shikataganai," it's over, forget it, it can't be helped. The phenomenon of post-traumatic stress syndrome, unknown 30 years ago, has silenced most internees. Today, we know how the experience of death, divorce, sexual abuse, and parental alcoholism can remain buried in the subconscious until the memory resurfaces years later, and it usually takes 20 to 30. For many internees, the original shocks of loss, family upheaval, and guilt were suppressed for many years. I realized the feeling I carried about the incarceration was one of deep humiliation, like a person who had been raped. You are the victim, yet you are sullied by the experience, ashamed to draw attention to it. For years, I felt guilty for the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Somehow, I was responsible for that infamous event. When I had asked my mother, why are we in this prison camp? I was then too young to understand war and politics. She said, it's because we are Japanese. She didn't say anything about a war with Japan. So in my mind, it was not only bad to be Japanese, it was criminal. Feeling guilty for the bombing of Pearl Harbor is similar to the feeling many Americans have for the atomic blasts over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Thus, crimes of a government can become sins of the people, and especially in the minds of innocent children. Like the Vietnam vets, it took from 20 to 30 years for the defenses to wear down. The time had come for a communal catharsis, a healing for the Japanese-American community and also for the United States. Spurred by diligent young Sansei lawyers, the struggle for justice culminated in the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which apologized for the government's actions and offered monetary compensation to survivors of the camp. This victory was not for Japanese Americans alone. It was a great victory for all Americans because the internment was an important American issue, not just a Japanese American one. For the first time in the history of this country, in 1942, all three branches of our government violated the Constitution, the highest law of the land. The Civil Liberties Act proved our Constitution is not just a piece of parchment under glass in the National Archives. It is a living, vital contract that binds us all together as Americans. And if that contract is broken, as in 1942, it is not just the rights of individuals that are threatened, but the very fabric of this democratic nation. Today, there are also many politicians and irresponsible media who find scapegoats to blame for the country's problems. And more, it seems, those scapegoats are immigrants, migrants, and refugees. How often do we hear, they are different from us? They have no idea of democracy and freedom. They don't speak our language. How many of us who lived through the racism and incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II remember what it was like to have those very words directed against one innocent group? But today, we should know better. We have the shoulders of Martin Luther King and others to stand upon. Our consciousness has changed. And because of this, our task is greater. For now, we are in a partnership, a complex relationship where we must learn about each other. No longer do we live in the simplistic structure of one group authoritatively dominating others. And so with those words, I will now stop and open for, I hope, your many questions and discussions. Thank you.
What kind of reactions did you get from your family to Farewell to Manzanar?
Thank you for that question. They were very nervous about it when they knew we were going to write about it. Because my husband said, you know, we have to get their permission. We're not writing about their personal experiences and how they felt, but we should have a meeting, which we did. And Now, for those of you who read the book or seen the film, there's a very powerful scene where my brother hits my father, you know, which to a Japanese, in a Japanese family, that was the, you know, the hierarchy was totally broken, you know, and the son is the father. I mean, of course, my father deserved it. He was drunk and attacking my mother. And, but it's a very powerful scene because it represents the breakdown of the family. And that meaning, this is what a terrible thing that happened to so many Japanese families who were interned like that. The family system broke down. And so we had a meeting, everybody was there, and the brother who actually was the one who hit my father was not the one that I wrote about in the book. And he raised his hand and he said, no, I don't want to write about my hitting Papa. I don't want that to be in the book. And Ray at the time had just converted to Mormonism. He was a Mormon and he was very involved in the church. And he also had a son who was, you know, in his teenage years and who was, you know, he had to deal with. So he didn't want his son to know that he had hit his father, that Ray had hit his father. And so we said, well, you know, that's a very powerful scene. We need that scene in there because it just shows how, you know, the breakdown of the family is the worst thing that could happen. And so everybody was quiet for a while. And then my other brother, Keo, raised his hand and he said, I know the answer. He said, what? He says, I'll hit Papa. He said, well, won't you feel like bad about hitting Papa? No, he says, because I didn't. But, so that's how we changed it, so that my brother, who was actually the one who did hit my father, you know, did not want to be written about that. So from now on, we talk about when Keo hit my father. So, yeah.
I work with many people that are impacted with drug and alcohol abuse, and I find that many of them have turned to that early in their formative years to escape traumas from previous years, and I'm curious if there's any statistics on how that might have impacted the internees in that fashion.
Oh, you mean that now you're saying that you know of individuals who have had drug problems and that what happened?
I work with people in that capacity. I'm just curious how the Manzanar experience or
Could compare?
camps would translate into that.
Well, you know, for one thing, I mean, I can't say that the actual taking of the drugs would be and what happens to the drug would be similar to what happens to the internees. But I think what might be similar is that the reasons for taking drugs, you know, it could be that maybe they feel rejected by their families and so forth, or that they feel like they don't, you know, that their family situation is broken up. Japanese did not become drug addicts, but they certainly, you know, suffered, and it was because of the breakup of the family, and also because, you know, I mean, we didn't eat together like a family. We ate in a mess hall. I mean, that's a real hard thing, you know, for a Japanese family to experience when the table where you have dinner is where everybody gets together and it's the meeting place for the family, and that was eliminated. So, but your question is about, is it why they did the drugs, or?
No, I'm just curious if there were many incidences of the internees turning to drugs as a result of the trauma that they experienced in these camps.
Not drugs, alcohol.
Okay, well,
There
alcohol
you
is
go.
a drug.
Okay, yes. I mean, my father did, but I mean, he drank before. I mean, it wasn't like that was something new. But he was, I mean, I'm sure he didn't, you know, become dependent or whatever it is, or brew his own until he was placed for a year. He was in Bismarck, North Dakota, which is a male federal penitentiary. And while he was there, I'm sure these men learned how to make alcohol, you know, brew their own. And then by the time he came, after a year he came to Manzanar, he definitely was addicted. and he, was making alcohol at home. Yes, and I think that almost all cultures that have that kind of, what do we call alcohol that makes you forget or whatever it is, and it can become, problematical because it's addictive. If it wasn't addictive, it didn't harm you, then it could be like an experience, right? Like a spiritual experience. But it has its effects. Does that answer your question?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Okay, something I'm curious about. You mentioned how your family reacted to hearing about the book and hearing about it being written and stuff. What kind of responses have you gotten from readers in foreign markets? Like, how did did you get any interesting responses from, say, the Japanese markets or markets in other countries? Like, what were some reactions that were pretty interesting from, markets in other parts of the world?
Well, okay, first I'll answer the first question, which was the family. But now, they were nervous about being exposed. I mean, that's, I think anybody who writes about themselves or about their family, everybody's nervous because somebody's going to read, they're going to all know about them. So there was that aspect, and of course it was my brother who did not want to be the one who hit my father, even though to us he was a hero. He thought, oh, I don't want my son to know I hit my father, and he also had just converted to the Mormon church. He didn't want to know the people in the Mormon church to know that he had hit his father. I mean, it's just this is the 50s, not the 50s, the 70s, so we thought differently. There was no book that had come out, a personal book about the internment. And I was, saying things that were very personal about the family. So they were nervous. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, though I was still curious about...
Oh, about the other world?
Yeah, how people in other
Oh,
parts of the
yeah,
world.
it's published all over.
Right.
And I have spoken, but it's very interesting because I've been all over Southeast Asia, and not so much Europe, but, it was for the film. We showed the film. And I thought this was a very interesting reaction that we had in the Philippines. It was at the University of the University of the Philippines, and they had shown the film to this class. And then my husband and I were doing a tour at the time, so we went there and to speak at the university there. It's a class smaller, about half this size. And so we were having this conversation, and somebody raised her hand. She said, well, that's all well and good. Your film was very good. But we want to know, what did the real Americans think about it? Okay? For a minute, I was stunned too. She said, what did the real Americans think about it? And so, I don't know where I got this, and I looked around because the Philippines, as you know, is very multiracial, culture and everything. So I said, you know what? You look Malayan, you look Spanish, I just went around and saying how different everybody looks, and I said, so which one of you is the real Filipino? See, and they got it. Because that's what you have to understand about countries that have so many different people. You're not going to look alike. There is no one way you're supposed to look. Thank you. Did you have a question back there? Somebody's hand was up.
I have a question.
Okay.
Did you have a hard time finding a publisher, and then did they want to edit your content at all? I mean, did you have a negative backlash, or were they supportive of?
Yeah, okay, thank you for that question. It's very interesting because my husband had written it, and he had written a letter or something to an agent that we knew in New York. So the agent hadn't read the whole book, but Jim had just said what it was about, would he handle it? So this agent wrote back immediately. He said, you know what? He said, I don't think this book will go. He said, there's a lot of anti-Japanese feelings now in New York. He says, they're giving us so much competition economically. He said, there's huge signs in the underground, that say, made in America, Japanese flags and so forth. In other words, his reason for turning it down was that there was anti-Japanese feelings. The agent didn't get it. The agent didn't get that we're talking about Japanese Americans, see? Okay, so Jim was so mad. Anyway, so he sent it to somebody else who did publish it, and they did a beautiful job and so forth. But it was hard to break New York at that point, at that time. That was in '73. Thank you. Now, somebody here, yes.
What were your living conditions like?
What?
What were your living conditions like? Like, did you have a daily routine?
Oh, yeah, what was our living conditions like?
Terrible.
Okay, did you read the book?
No.
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, I think the closest thing you would compare it to is would be like an army camp, but this is about families.
Yeah.
And that we are living in barracks, and that we do not eat in the barracks are just for sleeping. And there would be one barrack, and there would be it would be divided into maybe 2 or 3 apartments, and then you sleep in there, maybe 4 or 5 people in the barrack. And there were 12 of these barracks to a block, and there were 36 blocks in the camp in Manzanar. And each block had a mess hall. So everybody in that block would go waiting for breakfast, lunch, dinner, like the army, and eat at mess hall, so you can see how it destroyed family life. You know, it became a, well, what would you call it? We're like the army life. We even wore army clothes because it was so cold, you know, in Manzanar, Owens Valley, coming from Long Beach, California, and it was snowing, that we didn't have warm clothes. So they put all the World War I army, woolen army clothes, they just dumped it in the camps. But the women then, you know, they would, what's the word, redesign them, and they would make capes and jackets out of this. And so that's how we kept warm. Any other questions there? Does that answer your question to some degree? Yeah, it was like living in an army camp, but this was with families. It was a very terrible situation. It just broke up the family structure.
Did they separate you guys?
Pardon?
Did they separate you, like by families where you slept and stuff?
No, they tried to keep the families together, but we never, I mean, we want to eat with our friends. You know, we'd go way across, run a mile away to camp to, it broke up family cohesiveness. And the men were gone. My father was gone, so we had no leaders. And then soon the young boys were drafted. So it was a crazy thing. Somebody had their hand up over here. Was there a question? Yes.
Did the guards criticize you in the camp?
Pardon me, I didn't hear.
Did the guards criticize you in the camp?
Did the guards?
Criticize you in the camp?
You know, I didn't get that last part.
Did the guards criticize you in the camp?
Did the guards criticize?
Or treat you badly in the camp?
I mean, how did treat us in the camp? No, you know, the guards, we couldn't talk to them. So they would be up there, but I mean, now he probably came down and just took a picture, but they usually didn't talk. We used to go out to the, you know, towers, but some of them were nice, like they would throw chewing gum down. But they were told not to, what is the word, fraternize with us.
After the camps were closed and you were released, did they take you back to where you were from, or were you just kind of on your own?
Yeah, well, see, now that was a very, very difficult thing that happened because, you know, if you're renting a house or making payments on a house and then suddenly you're uprooted, you can't make payments to the bank on your house or your car, so that you lose the house. So that meant we didn't have places to go back to. Very few Japanese did, who had very good neighbors who took care of the land, or they took care of their house for them, or took care of their land. But that was not the majority. So most people lost whatever they had, a car. My father had lost fishing boat, a car, you know, and a home. So in our case, we were placed in a defense housing project in Long Beach called Cabrillo Homes. And these projects were built during the war for people to come to California and work in the defense plants. So then you had people from Michigan, I mean, you know, and Chicago, and from all back east. They all came to California to work in the defense plants and make money, and many stayed. And so they had to build these houses. Then after the war was over and the defense plants closed, some people left. So this was the, you know, not the only place, but one of the places where Japanese families could go and relocate.
What were the conditions like in the area that your family stayed?
What was the conditions like where in the family, in camp?
Where your family stayed?
Well, okay. Well, we lived in a barrack, but because we're a large family, we had like two compartments, 2 or 3, or like a whole barrack, but you know, different compartments. We didn't eat there, although my father refused to eat in the mess hall when he came. So my mother would go to the mess hall, bring his food back to him, and he would eat, you know, in our quarters. So it was according to how many were in the family, how much space you were given, and then, but the space was essentially how many, you know, where you would have space for cots to sleep. Because we only slept in there. We didn't eat in there. We didn't do anything. We just slept there. Because we had the mess hall to eat. We had a laundry room to wash clothes, and we had latrines. They called them latrines for men and women. Each block had a men's, women, and a ladies' latrine, which was a bathroom.
Was there any schooling for the children?
Pardon me?
Was there any schooling for the children?
Yes, there was no schooling for the first year. But after that, they emptied out one of the blocks and it became a school, Block 16. And I will say that I had the best teachers. They were wonderful people who came to camp to teach. They came from, they were hired by the government to come, but they came from all over. Like the woman who was such a wonderful teacher, I just loved her, and she came from the state of Wisconsin. And I always remembered that state, Wisconsin, because I thought it must have been heavenly because this wonderful woman came from there. So Wisconsin, where I've never been, is one of my favorite states.
What kind of food did you guys eat at the camp?
You know, I'm sorry, it's hard for me to hear.
What kind of food did you eat there?
What kind of foods? Well, it was really terrible at first because, we didn't have any professional cooks. The first, few weeks we were there, it was the Army that fed us, and they didn't know anything about how Japanese ate. So if they would give us, they knew we ate rice. So the rice, and then they had canned food, like canned spinach and canned apricots. And they would put it over the rice. Because they didn't understand and know, and everybody was too scared or to say anything. So it was terrible the first weeks and months until the Japanese themselves, started cooking in the mess halls. And then we had then we started our own gardens, and then we had a pig farm, and so forth.
Yeah, after you finished writing the book, is there anything that you thought about later that you possibly left out of the book? Is there anything that you might have thought again
Something that's an interesting. I think that writing the book was so cathartic, in some ways very traumatic, and that. The book was it. That was it. Do the book. It's published. I never have thought, well, we should have did it this way, or I never thought that. I thought that's it. If it is, that I should have done it a different way, then I should write another book. I think Farewell to Manzanar, how it is, because it's simple. It's written from a child's point of view, but yet you have an adult's point of view explaining it further. That it's easy to read for both children, adults, and seniors. I mean, the book is read by all ages. I mean, just last year, it was adopted by the California Council for Humanities as a community read, which meant that how many communities, there's been way over 50, adopted this book, and the community read it, and they would have, you know, lectures on it and study it, and then I actually went to about 50 different libraries and spoke.
Like, are there any like stories that like you
There are lots of stories of the...
like outside of the book that you could like tell us?
You mean, not my stories, but there are other stories. I mean, you know, if you look at the, what is it, the name of that, San Mateo, that she publishes Japanese American books. There are many books now out, not necessarily about life in camp, but about childhood, being a child, you know, in Japanese American culture. The reason why is that unless you experience camp, you know, and you want to write about it from a personal point of view, it almost has to be from someone who experienced it to give it that, you know, really, yeah, authentic feeling. I'm going to add something to yeah?
So I want to thank you personally for coming out here, especially, you know, it's an election year, and, you know, a lot of what you say, you know, it's just so ridiculous to think that this happened in the United States of America, you know, but
Oh, yes, we have to
when you
be,
hear politicians on TV talking about building walls and patrolling Muslim communities and stuff, you know,
yeah,
it's disgusting, you know, I think, and,
oh, yes.
you know, for you to come out and talk to people, especially young
Absolutely.
people, you know.
Oh, well, the whole Japanese American Citizens League has come out against
You
that.
know, you kind of mentioned it. Do you ever really think this could happen again? Or do you think that?
Yes, if we don't, you know, where I think a lot of responsibility lies right now is with the television and the press, because they're the ones that are letting us know. It's what they choose to show to us, you know, and so they, that's what we have to remember. It's their choice of what they're showing. We're not seeing the opposite effects, or the opposite, you know, people who are saying other things. But because it's such news, and they think that this is news and so forth, I don't know, I just think, how is it that they don't understand their responsibility of what they're showing? I mean, it's just like hypnotizing people when you put these things out there, and then people think it's all right. You know, that's how Hitler took power. I mean, they didn't have television, but, you know, he had all that publicity and so forth. And then you start thinking it's okay.
After the camp closed down, how long time passed before you returned back to Manzanar?
I'm sorry, I can't hear
After
you.
the camp closed down, how much time passed before you returned back to Manzanar?
You mean when my father's what broke down? You mean when the car broke down?
When the camp broke down, when the camp broke
With the
down.
camp,
Oh, when the camp closed
how long
down.
did it take before you returned to Manzanar?
A long time. Yeah, oh, no, I never went back. Never went back until many, many years, you know, after Farewell to Manzanar was written. Hardly anybody did. Why would we want to go back? And then, you know, then we saw that there was the importance of it, you know, historically and for this country. That, you know, this is what was done, this, you know, it was a big mistake. So we have to be aware of that how these things can happen so that we don't do it again to some other group. And that's what we have to be on top of. Because, I mean, when is it going to ever turn, you know, if we keep doing this, scapegoating people, I mean, you know, when is it going to be blondes? Right from Norway.
Right, because I mean, I don't know about you, but I mean,
Added something?
Pardon me?
Would you mind if I added something to your
Sure, please do. Anybody add anything?
2 years ago, we took some students from here to Manzanar for their annual pilgrimage, and a lot of the people who were at Manzanar or some of the other camps in the western U.S. came with their children, their grandchildren, sometimes their great-grandchildren, and they wanted them to learn, and it was open to anyone who wanted to learn so that they could find out. One of the slides was about this year's pilgrimage on April 30th. But they do this every year to remind people, as well as themselves, of what happened there, to make sure that they don't forget. And it was a really amazing experience for us to be there and hear everyone speak and to share their stories and to see them trying to make sure that this was something that wasn't forgotten.
And also, too, is I also think it's very courageous how the Japanese responded to this. You know, for instance, the 442nd. I mean, it was the most decorated battalion of its size for the whole war, for the whole World War II. And that was a group made up of Japanese Americans and many out of the camps, young men out of the camps. And they had the highest casualty rates, and they rescued the Texas Battalion, which was, I think it was in the France. Does anybody remember what forest that was? They were captured. They were either captured, they couldn't get out. And this was the lost Texas Battalion. Nobody could get them out. But it took the 442nd, this group of Nisei soldiers who went in and didn't give up, and they freed them, they captured them, but with a loss of a huge loss of life and wounded. But it's a great story in the village in France that they freed. To this day, every year, they have a celebration, and there are still some who are still living who were involved in that, and they go to France. But the French people have a statue of a Japanese Nisei soldier in the center of their town.
I'm just curious. I haven't read the book, the content of the book, but it seems interesting to me. Did the Japanese American people ever think to rebel during that time because of the feelings of sentiments? Or?
I can't quite hear you, but are you saying that what happened to the Chinese people here?
Did the Japanese American people in the internment camp ever think to rebel to the feelings of racial discrimination?
I mean, in the camps, yes, there was a riot.
Because I want to see the comparison what was happening in my country when there was over 333 years when Spain enslaved Philippines. We have a national hero that he went to abroad and studied the national affair of Spain, and then he fight our freedom to rivals. I just want to see the comparison.
I couldn't understand you.
Yeah, it just knowing that you have that experience in the camp, did you ever to suppress or?
Did we ever what? I'm sorry, I'm missing that word.
Suppress what?
Did you ever, the people in the camp think to rebel against?
You mean, did we ever rebel in the camps?
Ever think the people?
You mean in the camps?
Yeah.
Was there any, yes, there were some riots.
Sentiments?
There was a riot, yeah, there was a riot. But it wasn't about being in the camp, it was about, food or something like that, because at that point, why would we riot about being in camp? They're just, they just have more soldiers, we're at war. They considered us, dangerous. But still, there were riots in camp, various things about the food and so forth.
It's 8 o'clock right now, and so we'll clear out the theater, and thank you all for coming.